One quick caveat I would note, I found in the Fiscal Commission report that's out this morning, some encouraging tax reform ideas, some interesting corporate tax ideas. I know that Fred Smith will talk about that area of the tax code. But I wanted to highlight one other thing. The Commission co-chair's report this morning proposed limiting tax exclusions for various socially desirable activities to a fixed rate rather than having them in the form of an exclusion or deduction. Anyone interested in this topic could look up a fascinating Stanford Law Review article that I co-authored. I'm kidding. The Stanford Law Review article does exist that lays out the case for exactly this kind of approach, and I think that it's worthy of significant further debate. Let me end by just examining our long-term fiscal problem, which, as Pete has already mentioned, is disproportionately driven by healthcare. The way I like to calibrate this is to examine things as a share of the economy. Social Security is currently a little bit under 5% of GDP. By 2050, it is projected to go to 6% of GDP. Medicare and Medicaid are currently 5.5% of GDP, and by 2050, they're projected to go to 12%. That is where all the growth is. And then the question becomes, how does one address that growth? And there are basically four approaches. One can reduce prices or reduce reimbursement rates for providers, doctors, hospitals, and what have you. But ultimately, there's a limit to how much you can gain out of that, because if you're not getting at the underlying quantity of services provided, and all you're doing is ratcheting down reimbursement rates, say within Medicare, ultimately all you'll do is create an access problem for Medicare beneficiaries in finding a hospital or doctor. We must get at the underlying quantity of services provided. And that brings me to the second approach, which is quantity rationing. That is, even if it were desirable, which is debatable, not politically viable for the foreseeable future or perhaps thereafter. So let's just put that to the side and not even discuss it. A third approach, which is favored by many conservatives and which would have some benefits, is consumer-directed health care. And the thought here is that what we need to do is have more consumer skin in the game to help drive down costs in that manner. This would help to some degree, but the benefits are more limited than you would think. And the reason is that we will always provide very deep insurance against high-cost cases. That's, after all, the whole purpose of insurance. And indeed, even under health savings accounts, which are the favored mechanism for implementing consumer-directed health care, you do provide deep insurance above some threshold. And here's the kicker. In health care, the vast bulk of the aggregate cost comes from those high-cost cases. The top 5% of Medicare beneficiaries account for 40% of cost. The top 25% of beneficiaries account for 85% of cost. Consumer-directed health care is disproportionately aimed at the other 75% of beneficiaries, but they only account for 15% of aggregate costs. Ultimately, therefore, I come to my final point. If we are to alter the trajectory of health care costs, which is, after all, the core long-term fiscal problem that we face, we must get at the health care that's delivered in those high-cost cases, which disproportionately involve chronic conditions like diabetes and hypertension and so on and so forth. And to a first approximation, the health care delivered in those cases depends critically on what the provider is recommending. We must get at why some providers recommend this approach and other providers recommend some other approach. And that will involve a combination of better information, better incentives for quality rather than quantity, and it will inevitably have to be evolutionary. We do not have all the answers, and we will not have all the answers. We have to try something, adjust, and we need to have a much more facile way of doing that. So I will leave you with the following thought. In an increasingly polarized world in Washington, D.C., what happens by default is, to a first approximation, what happens. If you want to figure out the most likely outcome, look at what happens through inertia and bet on that. There are a variety of new institutions that are being created that will flip the power of default towards cost containment and quality improvement rather than the current system, which is directed in the other way. And I would highlight in particular the Innovation Center and the Medicare Commission. And let's take the latter one as just for a moment. The Medicare Commission created the so-called Independent Payment Advisory Board created under the Health Act is assigned the responsibility to hit a declining rate of growth over time, which would do a significant amount to address our long-term fiscal problem. Here's the key thing, however. When its proposals are put forward, they take effect automatically if the Congress ignores them, if one House of Congress votes them down and the other doesn't, if both Houses of Congress vote them down and the President vetoes that legislation. By default, the proposals take effect. I'll give you one granular example before I wrap up. A couple weeks ago in the New York Times, David Leonhardt wrote up a new proposal from Peter Bach and a co-author on how to reimburse under Medicare for new technologies. And what they suggested was that you pay in full for the new technology for some period of time. They recommended 3 years. And at that point, if the new technology has not demonstrated efficacy relative to pre-existing technologies, you reimburse at the lower rate of the old technologies. They used the example of prostate cancer, where there's a $10,000 older treatment, newer $40,000 and $50,000 treatments that have not been shown to be medically more effective than the older treatment, so they would be reimbursed at $10,000. If you tried to enact new legislation in a polarized Washington, D.C., and given the power of the various entities that would be affected by that kind of proposal, through the normal legislative process, I think your probability of success would be extraordinarily low and probably something like 0.00. If, however, it's done through the Medicare Commission, and this kind of proposal could be done through the Medicare Commission, the prospects for success, while not guaranteed, are much higher. That's one idea that has been put forward in the last month or so out of many, and the point is, you may not like that particular idea, but we need ideas like that in some way to try to test them out, implement them, and then move forward, or else we are on a fundamentally unstable long-term fiscal course. Thank you very much.